Hello and welcome to Voter Registration 101, some hints and tips for success. I had a hard time coming up with a decent title for this and a title screen because most of you, if you've tuned into this, either you have been doing voter registration already, or whether it's been your organization or you as a person, or you've volunteered with another group, including us, that you may already have some experience. But I hope that some of you who are watching this either live tonight or on a recording at a later date are brand new to voter registration. You've been wanting to get involved. You're excited about National Voter Registration Day that's coming up. And if that's you, let us know. Hop in the chat or leave a comment on the YouTube video and let us know. That would be great. I want to make sure that we um, can set you up for success. I genuinely I'm weirdly passionate about voter registration and civic engagement in general, which is a good fit because this is my actual job. So for those of you who are watching this live, if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to put them in the chat. I have time built in at the end to do like live Q&A, but if there's something along the way you want to put down that you don't forget it, please feel free. All right, so we're going to start with kind of going over some basics of voter registration. We'll talk about online voter registration, which is new and very exciting for Oklahoma. We'll talk about paper forms because they're not dead. They're still around and still very necessary. We'll do some kind of hints and tips about talking to voters, just some other things to remember, other hints, tips, potpourri, if you will, about doing voter registration. And then, as I said, time for Q&A in the end. So just to kind of hit the first things first, you got to be mindful about who is eligible to vote. And everything we talk about today in this video are things that I really encourage you to like learn and memorize so that you know it. The more equipped you are, the better able you are to answer people's questions. They will appreciate you. You will appreciate yourself. And it just goes for a more seamless experience than having to like fiddle through and look up stuff all the time. However, as a little pro tip early on, everything like there are handy visual aids throughout the registration process, whether you're doing online or on paper forms. If you're doing voter reg, you will have information at your fingertips should you need to reference it, and there's no shame if you do. I look up stuff all the time. But the more you have in your head, then it's just easier for everybody. So, of course, you must be a U.S. citizen and a resident the state of Oklahoma. You must be 18 years of age or older, or you can be 17 and a half, so 17 years and 6 months, and you will be 18 by the next election in which you're going to vote, right? So like if you're going to turn 18 on Halloween and there's an election a week later, that person can pre-register up to 6 months in advance. That's only happened to me once, and it was so exciting to register a 17 and a half-year-old last year. It was in the summer, and she was going to be 18 in like September or so, and so she would get to vote in the gubernatorial election last year, and so I got to pre-register. That was fun. If you're doing work in schools, there's a lot of seniors this would qualify for who aren't 18 yet but will be 18 like before the November election next year, those kinds of things. And it's important for them to know that they can go ahead and register. Anyone who has been adjudicated to be incapacitated in some way, like if the court has said you're not able to make these decisions for yourself, they are not eligible to register to vote. You have to be able to handwrite your signature. And with the online system, it means you would have already have submitted a signature when you got your driver's license. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And the one everyone kind of knows is if you've had a felony, then you are not eligible to vote or to register to vote for the duration of your sentence, the number of calendar days. And this comes up occasionally, especially if you're tabling at events, especially in a state like Oklahoma where we lock a lot of people up. And there's a lot of crimes that are classified as felonies, even some that arguably shouldn't be. And so the way that I explain this, if people don't know, is if you were convicted of a felony and you were sentenced to however long, let's say 7 years, it has to be 7 years before you can re-register. Let's say you served 2 years, in a facility, and then were released and are doing parole. It has to be until the end of that 7-year period. So just because you're not in prison doesn't mean that you are eligible to vote. You don't have to do anything special. You don't have to pay off fines or fees. That stuff is not the case in Oklahoma like it is in some other states. But you just have to serve that full amount of time has to pass. I was doing voter registration at an event that was focused around the recovery community. So a lot of folks with substance abuse issues and some mental health issues. And as you might imagine, there was a disproportionate number of folks that had some sort of justice involvement in that crowd. And it was awesome because almost everybody that I talked to said, "Oh, I can't register today." And I said, "Do you have, legal history or whatever?" And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "Do you know how long it's been?" And they could spout off, "I've got 17 months. I've got 28 months. Like so many of them knew exactly how much longer they had before they could re-register. And that was cool for me because it told me that they actually cared enough to vote, right? Like they knew that they lost this right and it was coming back. Like it wasn't gone forever. There's a lot of folks who think if they had a felony ever, they can't ever vote again. And that is not the case. So sometimes those are important conversations you might have, especially if you're just tabling like in a public event, a festival or a fair or something like that. But in general, 18 years of age and a U.S. citizen and a resident, right? And it's important to kind of know your audience, where you're doing voter registration. If you're knocking doors, you're tabling, you might have an idea about what the local community is predisposed to being, right? So if we do stuff on like the south side of Oklahoma City or somewhere that's a predominantly like Latino neighborhood, in some cases, in my experience, I've had a higher number of folks who came by and said, "No, I can't because I'm not a citizen." And they're certainly going to be usually a little hesitant or shy to kind of talk about that, which is why, as we'll discuss more later, it's so important about your demeanor and how you approach the event so that you can kind of like that you are creating a welcoming atmosphere, because folks may have questions about citizenship status or justice involvement that can be embarrassing for them to talk about. And our goal is to not make it embarrassing, right? Like just make it say, "Hey, that's okay. That's your situation. Let's go." All right, so let's talk about online voter registration, or OVR, as the cool kids say. Firstly, it's finally here, right? This was authorized by the legislature in 2015. That's a long time ago in present, like the speed at which time is passing, that's a long time ago. It was not implemented for 8 years until just the last couple of months. They finally got it activated. In general, it's great. The way that Oklahoma's online voter registration system works is very similar to most other states that have online voter registration. There's about 41 states now that have online voter registration, and like 38 or 39 of them do it exactly the same way, or pretty close to the same way, where they have a state-based form that you can fill out, that the state provides a portal of some kind on a website for you to go to, and to register that way. And in pretty much every state now, most every state, you have to have some sort of driver's license or state ID, for them to do a identity match, right? This is in lieu of a handwritten signature. This is a way that they can confirm that you are who you say you are. So in general, it will save tons of time, it will save money, and it saves mistakes, right? For all of us who have been doing voter registration for years on paper forms, if you've tried to read all of these paper forms, you know that penmanship has declined in our society. I'm guilty of that as well. I almost only handwrite notes for myself, and even then, it's a little sketchy sometimes if I'm going to be able to read that later. And with the paper forms, it meant that someone was handwriting stuff, right? Their own information. So that E could look like a C, could be too close, could be a D. It's really hard to tell. And then another human has to read that and type it into the system. So there's like another opportunity for mistakes to be made just totally on accident, right? People might omit a letter or a number, something that would cause their thing to get kicked out. And as we talk about paper forms in a minute, we'll explain that a bit more. But the online system eliminates all of that. You get to type it in, and it sends it over to the state digitally. And so there's no, I mean, there's still the room for a typo, but somebody reads in the back end to make sure that it is who you say you are, and everything should go pretty smoothly. When it first launched, I mean, like many of us got the press release, we're very excited and immediately hopped in to do it, and it didn't work for me. And I was like, I know that I'm registered. I know that I've got a driver's license. I know that of all the people, like this should work. And I tried it 3 times and it just wouldn't find me. And I got really upset. And then I realized, hey, they just launched this whole new system. And if you've ever launched a website before, or for those of us who remember when healthcare.gov launched like 10 years ago, that was a huge debacle. There were going to be bugs. And sure enough, within 2 weeks, I tried it again and it worked flawlessly. Had a bunch of friends that have all tried it. We've all re-registered as ourselves and it all worked fine. I got my new card in the mail. Works great. So if you happen to run into a problem, which we'll discuss, don't worry. It might be legitimate. It could just be a bug. That just because someone's online voter registration process doesn't seem to work doesn't mean that they are ineligible to vote. It can be frustrating, right? Sometimes you got to talk folks down, but in general, works great. Some limitations apply, and that specifically I meant you have to have a driver's license or a state ID in order to use the online system. And we can look at it here in a second, but basically when you go through, you have to enter your driver's license or ID number on there. And then when you click submit, it like runs a check in the background against the driver's license system, the DPS, Department of Public Safety, against their system and says, oh yeah, this is that person. And it matches your name, your number, your address, those kind of things. So that is possible. So, you know, well, I think the next slide, well, we'll get to it. No, I went the wrong way. Ding, ding, ding. Oh, did I skip a slide? Oh, I skipped a slide. Let me go back. And one of the other basics, we talked about who's eligible, things about a voter registration drive to know is that anybody can do it. You don't have to, political parties, private organizations, public organizations, you yourself, your grandma, anybody can do voter registration. In Oklahoma, there's no special training or certification. Some states you have to become officially a registrar that's been like trained by the state. That's not the case in Oklahoma. Doing this training today puts you ahead of the game for a lot of folks. So congrats on that. You can get the forms if you want paper forms. You can get them from your county election board. You can email them. That's usually the easiest way, or call them and say, hey, can I get however many forms you think you'll need? They're not going to give you thousands. Like, I think the most that any group I know has ever gotten at one time was 250. And you got to tell them a little in advance. That's a lot of forms. And so if you're getting that many, you're crushing it, and we'll find ways to make it happen. But you can also just like print forms off the state election board website. If you have access to a printer, that works too. And as a reminder, and I'll say this again later on, you cannot give any incentives to anyone to incentivize them to register to vote, or to vote, certainly. Anything you give out has to be available to anybody. So you can't, if you own a restaurant, you can't give a 10% discount for people showing their voter registration card or their sticker. You can't do that. People do, it always happens. but I'm just telling you, legally speaking, you cannot give any incentive that would incentivize someone to register to vote or to vote unless you make it available to everybody. So as a practice, if you've got giveaways at your table, stickers, bubbles, whatever you've got, pizza, you have to give that to everybody who wants it, right? Same thing, this comes up sometimes with actual voting. If people can like bring food to people who are waiting in line to vote, you can't just walk down and give it to people who are promising to vote for your preferred candidate. Like you can just give it to everybody. And the best way to do that would be to set it down and walk away, right? And just not be involved in that. So no incentives unless everyone gets an incentive, right? So like we give out stickers, kids love it. Usually parents don't care. The other thing we've done is like we had stickers made that said like I'm a registered voter, and obviously like only registered voters wanted those, but should someone ever ask me, can I have one of those stickers? Like, yes, everyone gets one, that's fine. We would just say, would you like one of these stickers? And people would say yes. So those are kind of some general basics there. Okay, online voter registration we talked about. We're going to talk about benefits and limitations. So the benefits of the online system is that it's free, it's easy, and it's online. If you've got a cell phone or an iPad or a laptop or whatever, you can do it right now. It's great. It exists all the time, 24 hours a day. People can register to vote. I'll be really curious to see the next report they put out about the number of people who are registered to vote and see if it's gone up because of this system, especially for younger folks who have been complaining about like, how dare you old people make us write forms, right? Like that kind of thing can have a big impact. It does work for the vast majority of eligible voters. Again, like most people who are eligible to vote do have a driver's license or a state ID. There are some that don't, and those people matter a great deal. We have to make sure that we're going to the nth degree to reach everybody, but for most people, system works great. And as we said, it avoids a lot of those mistakes due to illegible handwriting or just missing fields on the form. That's people forget to date it or sign it or put their county, and you can't. All the fields are required online, so it's real easy. A limitation, of course, is that it requires internet access. And for a lot of folks, especially in rural areas and even some urban areas that don't have reliable high-speed internet access, the system doesn't really benefit them. Like we have to reach them some other way, perhaps with a paper form. It does require driver's license or state ID. And as we mentioned, not everybody has those. You also have to have it on you, right? So if you are doing voter registration, if you're tabling somewhere and someone comes by and wants to do it, if they don't know their driver's license number, like off the top of their head, and I think I'm the only person I've ever known that knew my driver's license number, and they don't have their ID with them, but they're like, oh, my wallet's at home. Well, you can't do it today then, right? And that's a limitation. That's also like theoretically a limitation with the paper form, but there's some ways you can still register, but you can't then use the online system until you get it updated. So not insurmountable, but just like a little thing that I guarantee will come up, right? Dudes always are forgetting their wallets when they're in public. I don't understand how that happens, but frequently I'll be like doing the tabling and someone's like, oh, I don't have my wallet. I was like, how did you leave home? How did this happen to you? But try not to be judgy. Just okay. The website is smart, but not pretty, right? It's like me. It's useful. It's got all the information it needs. It's not as pretty as a lot of other websites out there. I think we have a certain standard for aesthetics that we're looking for. But you have to sometimes kind of poke around and go through multiple screens to get to the one you need, but it's all there. There's a ton of information on the State Election Board website if you take the time to poke around and find it. And then a limitation of the online system, and honestly of paper forms, is language availability. I think that the paper forms are available in English and Spanish, but it might only be English, and online I think it's only English. I tried to find a way to translate the page today into Spanish or Vietnamese or something else, and I couldn't figure it out. So that's certainly a limitation for folks that are non-English speakers. My little button is lagging and I skipped a slide and I knew it that time. All right, let's go back. So we've talked about online systems. We're going to talk about paper forms. I have here my handy thank you for voting tote, which we'll discuss more later as well. But I brought some visual aids in addition to the slides. We'll talk about more in a second. But first, the reports of paper form's death has been greatly exaggerated, just like Mark Twain. They still have a purpose. They still are useful. We still need them for all of the situations where the online system just doesn't work for one reason or another. So if someone doesn't have a driver's license or state ID, or if they try entering their information and they just can't find them, right? Like what happened with me when the form or the page first launched, just didn't find me, even though I knew I was entering everything correctly. So if that happens, it could be a glitch, right? There could be a typo somewhere in the system that they haven't worked around yet. So paper forms would be useful then. And just as 3 reminders, a paper form requires you as the facilitator there to do some extra checks. So to ensure that all the fields that are necessary for that person have been completed, and to ensure that the form has been signed and dated, and then make sure that the form has been properly and promptly submitted to the election board. There's not a time frame by which you have to do it. The state election board just recommends immediately, like do it as quick as you can. I recommend that also. And if you haven't ever seen a paper form, I'm going to show you real quick. Let me stop sharing my screen so you can see me full screen. So if you request the forms from the county election board, you get these. They're printed on like a nice kind of card stock. Let me make myself bigger. Let me do this. There we go. So it's like a heavier card stocky paper, and it comes as a 2-page booklet that can be torn in half. The first page has instructions. The inside has instructions, and then the second page is the form itself. And the back, you can kind of see here, it's really designed to be folded up and then mailed. And so I'll show you how that works. The instructions are really helpful, and I keep these even if I'm using like forms that I've printed out. If we were doing kind of a big bulk event, I keep these around on every clipboard, and some just floating around, because it's helpful to like refer to the instructions if you're talking to somebody, to say they have a question and you say, oh yeah, well right here you have to, it says to do this. So it's like when you do your taxes, there's like the form with the whatever the tax form is, it kind of explains it. This is easier to read than the tax form for sure, but it goes through all the things, including some information about like a political party that's important to know, and explaining their like residence address versus their mailing address. You have to give a residence address in order to register. You can also list a mailing address. So if you're a college student that gets mail on campus, but you're registered back home, you can still register, and maybe if you're doing mail ballots, get your ballot mailed to you. So on the form itself, and this is essentially how it works when you do the online system, is it just goes through each questions. So it starts at the top and it asks, are you a citizen of the United States? Will you be 18 years of age on the election? You have to say yes to both of those. Those are the clear eligibility questions. Last name, first name, middle name, birth date, give your driver's license, or the last 4 of your social, which is required if you don't have your driver's license with you. It says driver's license required, and then last 4 of social required if no driver's license, which can be a little misleading. And this is what I meant earlier, that if someone doesn't have their ID with them and they don't know their number off the top of their head, they can still register on a paper form and put in the last 4 digits of their social security number. If they don't have either one or don't know them, they can check this third box, and they'll probably have to follow up and provide some of that information to the county election board at a later date. They might get a call about that. So always try to encourage people. Driver's license is best. If you don't have one, do the last word of social. Picking a political party. Right now, Oklahoma recognizes 3 parties: the Democrats, the Republicans, and the Libertarians. They're listed in alphabetical order. Then there's 2 other boxes: no party or other. So other might be they affiliate with a party that is not a recognized party in Oklahoma. The Green Party, the Common Sense Party. There's parties in other states. People move here and cling to that affiliation. That's great. Maybe they want to try to get one of those parties recognized. Forward Party is one that's up and coming now. That would be other, and they can write it in what they wanted. And same thing with the online form, they can fill it out. And then no party is what we commonly refer to as an independent voter. That's me, for what that's worth. I'm not trying to sway anybody any direction, but just in full disclosure, if you check no party or you check other, your voter registration will be counted as an independent, because the other is not a recognized party. I think they just have it here to make us feel good if you happen to affiliate with a third party. You do have to pick a party. Oklahoma is somewhat unique in this. Some states, you don't pick a party when you register. You wait till you get to the polling place, and then you select which party's ballot you're going to vote on, like for a primary. But in Oklahoma, you have to choose a party or no party up front. You can change your party affiliation whenever you want. I think not more than once a day, but I think you can do it more than once a week even, except for on in even numbered years. You can't change your party affiliation between April 1st and August 31st, which is essentially like during the primaries. For state primaries, you can't, in primary runoffs, you can't change your party affiliation because you have to stick with the same party from primary to runoff all the way through. And if you are filing for office, like if you're going to be a candidate for office, I think you can't have changed your party affiliation for a certain amount of time before you file for office. But I forget the exact date. That's never come up in a voter registration drive, but I think that's something for your compliance person to answer if you want to run for office. Your street address, which is like your residence, your mailing address, if it's different. There's a box for county over here that a lot of people miss, so always check that. If you helped somebody fill it out, like if you were going with them and said like, okay, this is what this means, you can put your information here. Oh, sorry, at the bottom down here, this box number 6 is like if they've moved and they're updating their address. If they've moved from out of state, that's important. If they've moved across town or across the state from Oklahoma City to Tulsa to Norman or whatever, put that in there. It just helps the election board like know that, oh, this is the same person and not somebody new, so they can update your existing registration. Then there's an oath that you swear that you're a citizen, that you're eligible, none of this stuff. And it has a very threatening box at the bottom that says, if any of this is untrue, it's punishable by not more than 5 years in prison or a fine of not more than $50,000 or both. That same warning box is on the front page, which that, just me personally, like that can be a barrier to some people. It scares off some folks who read it and are like, whoa. So if I'm like, give the wrong address, I can have a felony. And it's like, I'm not aware of that ever happening or anyone ever being convicted by it. But you know how some folks are about voter fraud, just not really a thing. Then sign and date down at the bottom. And that's it. And if you're doing the paper form, you can crease it back and forth and then tear it in half. And then this piece, take the form and you can fold it up. It's even kind of like dented. I forget the term for that, but shows you where to fold it. You can fold it, you can put a return address. It does require a stamp, and you can just tape it and you can drop it in the mail this way. If you are doing a registration event where you're getting lots of paper forms, I always collect them and I put them in a big manila envelope and either mail or just drive, because I live in Oklahoma City, so I'll just drive them over to the state election board and turn them in. And that's perfectly fine. You can turn them in on behalf of the voters. It saves them a stamp. And I'll be honest, if someone filled it out and said, I'll mail this when I get home, they're not going to mail it when they get home, right? Like, you can't offer any incentives, but you can give them a stamp. That's the only thing you can give them, to mail it in, or just mail it for them. That's usually the way to do it. And that's it. So that's how the form works. Let me reshare my screen. All right. So as I said, like, make sure that all the fields are completed. And I just do a quick check and say, hey, before you walk off, let me check this is the case. With the online system, that's less of a risk because they've got to complete all the fields. I usually will stand there with them and help, just answer any questions they might have. But they click submit, and off it goes. So some tips about actually doing it and like talking to voters. First of all, you have to initiate conversations, regardless if you're doing paper or online. Not everyone's going to stop by the table on their own, right? Like, you must speak to them unless you've got some like really rad giveaways with like flashing lights and it's throwing candy at people or something. Even then, folks probably aren't going to come by. And in some cases, people would just kind of, if you're tabling especially, they'll kind of eyeball you from a distance. And that's where you have to say, like, hi, are you registered to vote? I always tell people, are you registered to vote? And they say yes. And you say, at your current address? Because there's a lot of folks that are registered, but not at their current address. And if they're not at their current address, they're probably not voting, right? So that's a great opportunity to help someone update their voter registration and to get them back into the system of voting, right? And it gives you a couple more minutes to chat with them about where they live and how long they've lived there, and just making small talk while they fill out the form. Say, it takes 2 minutes. You can do it right here. Here you go. As we've said, be friendly. This seems like common sense, but it's worth stating. Just making small talk with folks builds a connection. And when they get done, I always give them a big high five. Like, I like really celebrate the fact that they did that. It's kind of hokey, and people love that. Like, people want to know that voting is still cool and it's useful and it's important, and that they, by registering to vote or updating the registration, like, they are making a difference already in the future of our state. And the more that we can celebrate that, the better. I would like to buy a big bell and like ring a bell every time someone registers, just because it sounds like fun, and other people then look at you, and then it's like a way to bring people in, right? And again, everybody gets a sticker or whatever who wants one. You can't offer any incentives, so you have to give it away to everybody. I recommend, for our organization, we're a nonpartisan organization. I find it helpful to remain nonpartisan when doing voter registration. As I said at the top of the presentation, political parties and candidate campaigns can register voters. They are obviously not going to be partisan, right? They're going to try to register people that align with their party affiliation. But there's a lot of groups, and honestly, a lot of voters, an increasing number of voters are not affiliated with either of the two major parties. Most, especially young voters, most of them are registering independent these days. And it is harder to have a conversation, I think, or to initiate a conversation if you're coming at it from a partisan lens. Not always. Sometimes it's advantageous, but in general, if you're tabling at a public event and you don't know who's going to walk by, it is helpful to have everybody kind of talk, and everyone kind of feel welcomed. And honestly, in my perspective, and my more partisan friends on both sides would disagree with this, but if our goal is higher voter turnout, right? then the cream of the crop, the top goal is for 100% registration and 100% turnout. And then we would really know what most Oklahomans want, right? Like that's the gold standard. We're never going to get there. But the more people that participate, the more accountable our leaders are to the voters. And also, someone's party affiliation may or may not determine where they are in that continuum between the two parties right now. So, like I said, I try to stay nonpartisan. The one thing, though, that is important to explain to people, especially if they've moved here from out of state, and even if they haven't, if they're newly registering because they're not registered, people don't know. And they will often ask you, well, what does it matter which party I pick, right? They may be like, all these guys are crooks. What does it matter? It's like, well, you can pick no party, but here's what it means, right? And the important thing is that Oklahoma has partially closed primaries. That means that for the primary elections, that Republicans currently, the Republican Party allows only registered Republicans to vote in their primaries, and the Democrats allow only Democrats and independents to vote in their primaries. And libertarians only allow libertarians to vote in their primaries. Although I'm not aware of them ever having two libertarians in the same race where they had a primary. Maybe it's happened, but there's only about 19,000 registered libertarians in the state. And so for a lot of races, this means that choosing to affiliate with a party or choosing not to affiliate might mean that the voter can't vote in all the elections. Excuse me real quick. As an example, last year, the race for Attorney General is a good one. So the primary was between the previous AG, John O'Connor, and the Republican primary was between John O'Connor and Gentner Drummond. And then there was a libertarian candidate who filed as well. And so they're automatically on the ballot because they didn't have a primary. There was no Democrats who filed. So it was just two Republicans and a libertarian, which meant that all the Democrats and all the independents in the state, and all the libertarians for that matter, didn't get to vote in that Republican primary. And we all kind of know, like, that's the real race, right? The winner of the Republican primary is very likely, and of course did, go on to win the general election. And so Gentner Drummond won the primary, but not by a lot. He squeaked out a win and then went on to, well, thoroughly trounce the libertarian in that race. And everybody got to vote in the general election, but had it gone the other way, then the race could have been between John O'Connor and the libertarian, and that might have shook things up a little bit. But that's a good example. There's other races where, especially in the legislature, where there will be two or three candidates who file for a seat, but they're all the same party, and so only that party gets to vote, and that means everyone else doesn't. And so there is some consequences. And so, if you live in a rural area or an urban area, like just the partisan slant of geography these days can have a consequence on what elections in which you are able to vote. So that's a big deal. So I try to explain that. People usually get it if you kind of break it down pretty simply and just say your party affiliation can determine which primaries you're able to vote in, and here's why. And usually people are like, oh, well, that's a dumb rule. Like, we should have open primaries, and that's another conversation we can have another day. Yes, we should. But we said the paper form, always check it before they go, make sure they've done it and signed and dated it. If they didn't, it won't be processed. And I try to encourage people, if they're doing a paper form, say, hey, here you go, here's a pen. Please write as legibly as you can. Like, be very careful, just to make sure. I've had a lot of registrations, especially for students, high school and college students, that had really bad penmanship and didn't didn't get processed. Like we went to go check on them later, they hadn't gone through. So that's a big deal. And then before they walk away, regardless of how they registered, try to give them some information. If you've got handouts or anything to take with them about when the next election is, that's a big deal, because a lot of people will register, especially right now, right? If they're registering right now, most voters in Oklahoma won't have another election until March, right? And that's like the presidential primary. And so they're not going to be thinking about it for a long time. Often voter registration happens detached from an election, and then it's not top of mind, especially if it's not like right before a presidential election. So just letting them know that there are elections coming up all the time. The state election board publishes a calendar of all of the possible dates. And there's like a possible date almost every month. So when you have vacancies, like there's a special election coming up in October, there's going to be another one early next year, I think, for some of the vacancies. There's one in Lawton that's next month, and there's going to be one in Edmond here pretty soon as well. And so those folks, there's an opportunity to vote much sooner for people who live in certain areas. We try to update that stuff on a calendar on two places. One is on letsfixthis.org, which is my organization's primary website. We also run okvotes.org, which is kind of a broader net of a lot of groups that are doing voter registration. There's a community calendar on there with a bunch of voter reg events coming up. You can check. I'll probably just merge those calendars and have them appear on both websites, but that's where we're at right now. And then some other hints and tips. Good, we're right on schedule. I'll be done in just a second. Signage helps. If you've got a table with like a black tablecloth and you're just standing there with clipboards that nobody can see, they don't know what you're doing, right? If you've got t-shirts, we've got shirts for sale that say Oklahoma Votes on there. If you've got a big sign, even if it's like a poster board that your kids made that says register to vote, that's great. Anything's helpful. I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico this summer at their big farmers market, and the League of Women Voters had a booth, and I saw the League of Women Voters of Santa Fe sign, and I didn't know immediately if they were just there like tabling as an organization trying to get members. And then my kids noticed there's a big sign above them that said register to vote, and my son said, "Hey, that's probably your friends, huh?" Because they know this is what I do. And I was like, "Oh yeah." So I walked over and said hello. So just a sign that says, register to vote very clearly is very helpful. Something else that I like to do on clipboards is I made a little sign that I taped to the back of all of our clipboards. So if you're walking around in the crowd, you can hold them up. That's helpful. And that way you don't have to be yelling, you're not selling like popcorn at the ballpark here, but people kind of know what you're doing. Find a font, make it red, white, blue, or something that looks kind of official. That can be helpful as well. Bring lots of pins. If you're doing voter registration now with the online system, you can use your phone. So maybe bring like extra battery packs to charge your phone or your iPad if you've got iPads or whatever your device is. Don't count on there being electrical outlets anywhere, but bring whatever supplies you need. I have a few like voter reg kits. Well, we have some kits for sale on our website, and I'll send you all the link, but you get this very fashionable tote that says thank you for voting. You get a couple of clipboards, a bunch of forms, you get some pins, some stickers, some instructions. I have all this stuff in kind of handouts with instructions that are real handy. You get a stamped, already addressed envelope to the state election board, so you can put forms in there. So kind of a kit. I also usually bring stuff I don't need. Usually, right? I bring like a pair of scissors, some duct tape, some scotch tape, rubber bands, a bunch of those like bulldog clips, like the black and chrome clips. You never know what you're going to happen, especially if you're doing stuff outdoors in Oklahoma. You need rope. I always bring like some rope. because we got to tie stuff down. It's always windy, and whatever you think is going to happen, it's going to happen. And even if I haven't had to use it, I've lent it to other people. I was tabling at an event, and the people next to me had a big vinyl banner, but they only had 2 ropes, and it tied up, but it was just blowing in the wind. And I was like, oh, I've got some extra rope and some scissors. And that allowed us to tie the bottom corners down so their sign would stay put. And I made a friend, and then I got them to register. And it was like, just we're all in this together, right? Like, it's a good community thing. Always be prepared. If you're going out in the community, try to bring volunteers that match your target audience. The one thing that stands out to me is when I have done community stuff, like at a festival, like especially if it's in a hip part of town. If I have younger volunteers that can go out and talk to other students, it's much more effective, right? Like 25-year-old dudes are going to talk to 25-year-old girls more than they're going to talk to me, right? And so there's like a strategy in like having people that look like the audience you're targeting. Same thing, knocking doors, trying to have folks that are from a particular community can be much more helpful in facilitating and like building trust and starting those conversations. I mentioned earlier about asking if they're registered at their current address. That's really helpful. As I said, be prepared, know the form, know the system. You can go on the state election board website and test it out. You can register yourself right now, and so you know how it goes. And we'll walk through that real quick in just a second. And then, as I said, explain what happens after they register. So aside from just when the next election is, I tell people like, okay, you've submitted your voter registration today, or I'm going to mail it for you tomorrow. You will receive a voter registration card in the mail in about 2 weeks. It'll come as a letter from the state election board. It'll have your card. On the card, it has your polling place, it has your name. I will often pull out mine to show them it looks just like this. Here's my polling place. And when you go to vote, you can use either this or your driver's license. You have to use one of them. You go in. And that's usually about as much as anyone has patience to learn. If they want to know, like, what do I do next? How do I get the ballot? All that stuff. Like, at that point, direct them to a reliable resource, like Let's Fix This. And we've got some videos kind of in the hopper about how to vote. Like, what does it look like to go into a polling place? What to expect to get checked in? All that stuff, right? Like, the act of voting can be kind of intimidating for first timers. It feels intimidating to me, and I love doing it. I go all the time. I have t-shirts with like I voted stickers screen printed on there. Like, it's a big deal, but it still feels like, am I doing something wrong? Like, I don't want to break any rules. It feels like test day in some way. So I think anything we can do to help like reduce the barrier for folks is really helpful. 2 other things to remember is that forms must be received by the election board, by the state election board, at least 25 days before a given election. If they don't get it, they need that much time to process it, mail the card out, all that stuff. And so that's why, like, you see a lot of groups that will do voter registration up until like the first week in October and then just stop, because it doesn't do any good to register voters for those next few weeks, because they won't be able to vote in the next big election, right? And so when you're timing events, just make sure you know that you're giving this election board enough time to process everything. And then, as I said earlier, you can't change party affiliation between April 1st and August 31st in even numbered years. I think you can change it theoretically, it just won't be processed until after August. This is, to avoid party flipping, where people would vote in one primary and then switch. I don't know that's ever really happened. That's a lot of work. And to orchestrate that with tens of thousands of people would be really hard. So I don't think it's really a thing, but you can't do it anyway. This, as I mentioned earlier, this is the calendar for next year for all of the potential elections that we would have next year. January, February, March, April, June, August, and November. That's a lot of elections. You'll see the gray ones. Those are prohibited and even numbered years. And that's, I think, to allow the election board sufficient time to get ready for the next election, right? Like they've got to print forms and get them mailed out and absentee ballots. There's a lot of work involved. They need more time. So that's the case. It has the election type. So a lot of these, it's say special elections or propositions or candidates. Those there's not necessarily election everywhere on each of these dates. There might be an election somewhere in the state on those dates because, you know, there a special election for the city council in Cordell or the school board in Medill or something like that. Like a lot of places might have a vacancy to fill. And so they have those. And that can be really tough. There's been bills in the past that sought to kind of combine these into, I don't know, like just one date every quarter or something to kind of consolidate some of these elections. Those bills haven't gone anywhere, but nevertheless, here you go. And then the resolution date is essentially like if something is going to, a proposition or a state question is going to be on the ballot, how much time it has to be certified for the ballot before in order to qualify for that date. It's got the filing periods for candidates for the presidency and for all the state offices. And then the last day to begin the special filing period, if they're going to have a special election, and then the voter registration deadline for each of those. So you can see at the bottom right, October 11th is the deadline before the presidential election on November 5th, as an example. This is a very busy table. And this is what I meant earlier about the website being pretty, or being smart but not pretty. Lots of good information, but layout is not ideal. If you want more information, you can go to Oklahoma Votes, okvotes.org. Go to letsfixthis.org as well. We've got a lot of information there. And then the state election board website, as I said, is a great resource, oklahoma.gov/elections. All right. And on that note, if you go to the state election board website, then you can, right at the top, they've got they've even added colors. It's like red, white, and blue for the Oklahoma voter portal. And that lets you go in and register votes or register voters. You can register to vote in the portal. If you're already registered, you can check your registration status, make sure that you're still registered. You can request an absentee ballot on there for a specific election or for the whole year or the remainder of the year. And there's a few other, you can find your polling place, you can view sample ballots, which is really cool and handy. It'll pull up your actual ballot so you can see who's on it. So that's it's actually a really great tool. Again, a little unwieldy, but still good. And one other note on OKVotes and on Let's Fix This, we have there we go. Let me share my screen. So again, share. If you go to okvotes.org, on this website, if you go up the top, there's a button that says register, or these buttons, the 4 blue squares right in the top row, register to vote. It takes you to a form where you can do this. Right now we've partnered with Rock the Vote. I think we're about to add a partnership with Turbo Vote as well. Both are nonprofits that help other nonprofits register people to vote. And so people can fill out this form here instead of going to the state election board. And on Let's Fix This, same thing. I think it's under resources, helpful links. I need to move it front and center. Maybe it's just /vote. There it is. I updated this with the calendar of elections next year, potential ones. And the same thing, it's the same form, same colors, it all makes sense. And so a person can go here and fill it out. One benefit of doing it this way, rather than going straight to the election board website, is it adds a step, but it's an important step, right? So the step is they enter their email address and their zip code, and like I can do it this way. And it gives you all the questions. You're a citizen, you fill out your name and address, all that stuff. And it says if you have a current driver's license or state ID, then you may be eligible to finish your registration using the Oklahoma online system. So you fill all this information, and you answer this question, yes or no. And if it's yes, like it is for most people, and you click next step, then it routes them straight to the form on the state election board website, where they have to re-enter the same information. And that is like a little annoying, but it's just your name and address. It's not like a whole big form. And the benefit of this is that it allows us to capture some of their information, just their name and email address and address mostly. And that way we as a nonprofit can help follow up. And we've been doing this for a long time. I can't tell you how many folks think they registered, but they don't. And if we know who they are, the Rock the Vote and Turbo Vote automatically check every month. So I get a report of everyone who used the form, and then they automatically check the state's voter file to see if they successfully registered. And if they didn't, it allows us to serve as a check on the government to say, hey, these 5 people submitted their voter registration, but it doesn't appear that they're in the voter file. Like, can you look into that and kind of find out why? And that way we can just make sure that the state really is processing everyone that is applying. Without knowing who they are, we don't know how to follow up. It also allows us to then make sure that those people, or give them a chance at least, to receive updates like election reminders and that kind of thing. That can be really helpful, or volunteer with us. But it really has been helpful in the past so that we can do that follow-up. The online system is way better than it has been, where I've had to manually enter all this information into a big spreadsheet and then manually check them on my own, or with my interns, and that's a very time-consuming process. And so the fact that it is now all electronic just makes the whole system work a little more smoothly. Okay, I'm going to take a breath and read the chat. I see a couple of comments. Our campus of a voter registration event. Follow up with me later, Latanya, and I'll send me an email, and I'll see what we can do and get you whatever we can help out with. I'll put my email in the chat. And the media kit, or the kit as well. I'll find that in just a second. Katie said some pins with the iPad. Oh, that's a good thought. Yeah, so, and you actually bring up a good point. When you fill out the form online, you don't sign anything. The reason you put your driver's license number in there is that it syncs, or it does a check against the DPS system. And whenever you get your driver's license, you have to sign on that little digitizer, which looks nothing like your actual signature, probably, but it's printed on your driver's license, and so they consider that your signature. So as long as you fill it out and you say, yes, it's me, it checks and verifies, yes, that's that person, and that counts. So you don't have to actually sign anything. All you have to do is type in your name, your address, your date of birth, and choose your party affiliation, and that's it. And that's another important thing to mention on, if you use the forms like on our website, is that we don't capture party affiliation because we're nonpartisan. We're not, that would compromise our IRS status, so we don't even capture that. We just really need to know who they are, and if they sign up for email updates from us, then I get a message, and if not, then it just tells us like their name and if they successfully registered. So, any questions? I'm going to take a drink, but feel free to just hop on and ask or type it in the chat if you would prefer.
Andy, Lindley here. How are you?
Parched, but good.
Okay. I had a question for you about at a registration, let's say someone has a disability. Specifically, I'm asking about visual impairment, where I know you mentioned there's a small box if you're helping someone read through something, but let's say they are completely visually impaired, where you will be actually reading it and they cannot check you while you're reading it.
Right.
Completely proxy. How does that work?
So that, let me find the instruction page. Um, you can fill it out for them, and yeah. So they don't have it on the instructions. I'm almost certain, Lindley, and I will confirm this, or you can always call the election board as well. But in those cases, that's why there's a little field at the bottom to say, if someone helped you fill this application, the helper should write his or her name and address here. It's a tiny little box. It's on the digital form as well. You can do that. The person would have to be able to make a signature on there, and you can put their hand there or whatever. That's an option. And I think the county election boards, I don't know if they have a braille version of the form. But that's an option. And then I haven't tested it, but now I want to. With some websites have accessibility features that will read the form to them or read the screen to them. I'm not sure, but that's a really good question. So I give you half an answer, and I'll find the other half and let you know.
As far as visual accessibility, the election boards are really fantastic. If someone does ask about that, you have to go to the election
Yeah.
board. Like the independent voting centers don't have them, but they do have systems that will completely read through and you check with boxes. So if that's a question that comes up, I was just curious about the registration process itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things where, like, if you I haven't had it happen in the community, but like if I had a relative that said I need to register, I would just fill out the form with the assumption that they would trust me to write down the correct information on there. And I guess they could verify it later. So this is why like trust is a big deal. If and then when in doubt, yeah, I'm sure the election boards would be accommodating at the election boards, but that's can be obviously a barrier for folks as well. Good question, Lindley. Question in the chat: has Oklahoma legislature passed any laws that impact voter registration events? No. So we've seen a rash of legislation around the country about this. Not in Oklahoma. Oklahoma runs a pretty tight ship, and in fact, like over the last 5 years, we have loosened our. I use that term loosely. We've we've made it easier to vote in like one very tiny way, two ways. One, we've activated online voter registration, which is a big deal. And secondly, we added 1 day of early voting. So now we get 3.5 days instead of just 2.5 days. Now there's a lot of other states that like shorten theirs from a month to 2 weeks. And that still sounds very generous compared to what we have. But we didn't have drop boxes, so we couldn't take those away. We've never had those. We don't have any kind of registrar requirement for voter registration events like we have in other states. Texas has that, Florida. I somewhat anticipate we might see some of these types of legislation come up next year, just because they're kind of making their way around the country. It may be because Oklahoma is such a stronghold for the Republican Party that they don't feel threatened by that. So as if things got more competitive, we might see more of those pop up. But so far, it's been pretty copacetic when it comes to legislation. Yeah. Any other questions? Hopes, concerns? All right. I am going to put in the chat. Here's the link to the little voter reg kit. I have a couple of those to mail out tomorrow that had requests. I got a big box of clipboards in the mail from Amazon yesterday as well to make some more. So that's exciting. If you're interested, please feel free to put that in there. If you're in Oklahoma City, you can either pick it up or I can meet you somewhere and save us both the cost and hassle of shipping. There's an option for local pickup, but you can just drop me an email and we can work that out, or I'll email you. I'll get that when you do it. And then I mentioned OK Votes with National Voter Registration Day coming up on September 19th. There's a lot of events happening on that day and just kind of around the state. And so we've got this website. You can submit your events on there. Once you submit it, it should show up somewhat automatically. And we're really trying to build like a culture of voter registration. Like this needs to happen all the time, every month, all year, all the time, doing that kind of stuff. And so this website is up and running all the time. If you've got other events coming up, whenever you submit something, I get an email that I can send to our comms people to help promote. So it's kind of we're starting to kind of build, ideally, a kind of an automated system that helps churn this stuff out so that people know. But if you aren't doing something on your own, but you want to volunteer, please reach out anytime and let us know. We've got an event on September 30th that we're doing Deposit District in Oklahoma City. We need volunteers for that. And a lot of our partners have events happening as well. We'd love to help you get plugged in. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Enjoy the rest of your evening and go forth and register voters.